Welcome to this episode of Fridays with Fintelekt. My guest today is Isabella Chase, Research Fellow at the Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies at the Royal United Services Institute based in London. Isabella's work focuses on government policy responses to financial crime, and she's also leading a 2-year project which assesses the impact of the FATF framework on digital financial inclusion. Her other research interests include new payment technologies, e-money, sanctions, and financial crime involving high-value goods such as art. Isabella holds an MA in Intelligence and International Security with distinction from the War Studies Department at King's College London. Isabella, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
So, Isabella, I know that you host the CFCS podcast called Suspicious Transaction Report. So for a change, I think you are going to be on the other side of the table and answer questions instead of asking them.
It's a real joy. Yes, funnily enough, so much prefer being on this side of the microphone. So yes, it'll be a real treat for me.
Super. So Isabella, at the outset, can you tell us about, let's say a day in the life of a research fellow at RUSI? What do you do? And a quick snapshot of all the projects that you're involved in personally at RUSI right now.
Absolutely. Well, a day in the life of a RUSI research fellow, I would say it's quite hard to describe because we tend to have really varied days. I would say much less varied over the past 18 months when we've been continuously working from home, but we do have plenty of variation. And I think that's reflected in the projects that we work on. So, for example, as you mentioned, I've been very busy over the past 18 months leading this project that we'll talk a bit more about later on, which looks at the impact of the FATF framework on financial inclusion and also digital financial inclusion, but have in the meantime also been closing out with a couple of colleagues a multi-year project that looks at the illicit trade and money laundering risks of free trade zones. And as part of that project, we built an online tool that helps users risk assess different free trade zones around the world. So if FTZs fall under your remit, I would highly recommend visiting it at ftz-risk.rusi.org. And of course, we spend lots of time monitoring the various reforms to AML regimes around the world, most notably in the UK, where we do a lot of work tracking and aiding in the implementation of the UK's economic crime plan. So that's another thing that's been keeping me busy over the past few months. But of course, what I would always say, what I do is just a very small fragment of what my colleagues do at the CFCS, where, as you say, we have people working on counter-terrorist financing, sanctions, countering corruption, and of course, we do quite a lot of work on new technologies, cryptocurrencies, CBDCs, for example. So as we always say, wherever you find that intersection of illicit finance and security, you'll probably find someone at the CFCS doing some work on it.
Fantastic. So, the 2-year project, which assesses the impact of the FATF framework on digital financial inclusion, what motivated you to work in this area, and what aspects of this project would you say have really spurred you on to research this subject?
Well, I think, when you look at the work of the Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies, we have always been interested in the unintended consequences of regulation. So whether that be, the historic de-risking of the not-for-profit sector, or just more broadly, the impact of regulations on remittances and correspondent banking services, they're all topics that we've always been interested on and kept an eye on. But I think what really motivated us for this particular project was a document that came out in 2019 that accompanied the move by FATF from a semi-permanent mandate to a permanent mandate. And in this document, it reads, there's a statement that says, the FATF will continue to promote financial inclusion and encourage proportionate and effective implementation of the FATF standards by countries in line with the risk-based approach. And myself and the CFCS director, Tom Keating, we read the statement, we thought, wow, that's really interesting. It's people who spend pretty much all our days down in the weeds of the FATF system. We're not 100% sure of this work that FATF does to continue to promote financial inclusion. So we just wanted to better understand what that work was in more detail and evaluate really what the impact of the framework and the organization has been on financial inclusion in all of its guises. And of course, that's where we started. But within 4 months of the project, the coronavirus pandemic really intensified and we were all forced into lockdown. And I think that gave a real fresh urgency to understanding all the barriers to financial inclusion as governments around the world really rushed to get disbursements and support payments to their populations. And especially when using digital channels, increasingly things like digital identity and straight through processing of payments, eKYC became much more interesting and high profile topics for policymakers around the world. And so that gave a really did spur on our research. And I think what we found to be really interesting was, the current Findex survey figure from 2017 is that 1.7 billion people around the world have no access to a bank or mobile money account. And of course, the majority of those people live in the global south, but there is a small proportion who also live in the global north. And what we saw in the UK, where we have over 1 million people with no access to a bank or e-money account, is that policymakers here also were reminded of the importance of tackling financial exclusion and all of its barriers. So yeah, it was we started off with a 2019 statement, and it was really accelerated by the complete unforeseen events of the pandemic.
Right. So, Isabella, you wrote about the lack of incentives for financial inclusion in your article last year. The article was titled "Doing What Is Right: Financial Inclusion Needs Better Incentives." And, a lot is spoken within various stakeholder communities about maintaining a balance between AML/CFT controls and financial inclusion. So, has the risk-based approach introduced by the FATF way back in 2012 actually helped? And what do you see as the way forward?
Sure. Well, as you say, the risk-based approach introduced in 2012 certainly should help balance financial inclusion and financial crime controls by its nature. It allows for that proportionate application of due diligence controls in identified low-risk scenarios, which for supporting financial inclusion is really important because you can use those simplified measures. Thinking of an example, as I said previously, eKYC can be a big problem, and identity documentation is a key hurdle there. So if you have, for example, segments of the population who you've identified as low risk but don't have traditional ID documents, you can reduce your requirements to allow credentials which are more appropriate for that population. So really important for that reducing of controls is really important for increasing access. And that all sounds great in theory, but unfortunately in practice, what we see is the implementation of the risk-based approach doesn't always achieve that balance between robust financial crime controls, which obviously is the priority, with financial inclusion objectives. And I think, why do we see this being a problem? Well, the sort of foundation of a risk-based approach is a really good understanding of risk. If you understand your risk, you can apply your controls proportionately. But if you don't understand your risk, then that proportionality becomes impossible to achieve. And how do you understand risk? Well, at a country level, you perform a national risk assessment, and at a regulated entity level, you'll have your own private internal risk assessment. And what we saw from our research, and this is common across the entire world, I think, risk assessments are really complicated exercises to carry out. And rightly, a lot of countries and regulated entities struggle with them. And in that struggle, I think what is lost is a confidence to assign products and sectors a low risk rating because of fear, which I think in parts is rightly there, of criticism from either FATF or other international bodies, that if you were to assign low risk and for someone to disagree, you would get into trouble for that. And that the stakes are pretty high if you're a lower capacity country trying to maintain maybe your last dollar clearing license. So I think what we see is, despite the really good intentions of the risk-based approach, what you end up with is people erring on the side of caution, moving more to higher risk ratings. And of course, that's sort of to be expected, because using simplified measures in low risk scenarios is completely optional within the FATF framework. Enhanced due diligence in high risk scenarios is mandatory. But if you don't want to work in the lower end risk of the spectrum, you absolutely don't have to. And also, you have to ask yourself, what is the reward of doing so? We see very little benefit other than financial inclusion objectives to really work and make sure simplified due diligence measures are in place in an effective way. So that being said, you look at the sort of difficult to operationalize, very few incentives. It's not a surprise that we don't see simplified due diligence used as much as it could be. I think when we look to the way forward, obviously, we did come up with a set of recommendations in our papers. We make 5 recommendations of really how can you make that risk-based approach work better for both financial inclusion and financial crime, but also just how the wider FATF framework can better support financial inclusion. And as I say, they're in much more detail in our papers, but to give you a very brief summary now, we said, we called for a update to the FATF recommendations so that they better promote those compliance practices that support inclusion. So again, really looking at simplified due diligence, updating the methodology for mutual evaluations so that there would be a greater recognition of how financial inclusion can contribute to the overall effectiveness of a country's AML CTF regime. And here, I think, we're really looking at that inclusive financial integrity argument, where the more people you can include in the system, the more you have better oversight of the financial crimes that occur, and you can really increase the overall integrity of the economy. And of course, that also is great for development objectives. We also call for the strengthening of FATF assessor training, of measuring the impact of the International Cooperation Review Group process, or the FATF grey or blacklists, on financial inclusion, and really ensuring that all the stakeholders in this ecosystem of financial crime, whether that be FATF or the policymakers in governments, really understand that promoting financial inclusion is key to the successful implementation of the FATF framework. So joining everyone together and making sure that really becomes a collective goal. So, that would be our 5-point plan to better using the risk-based approach to promote financial inclusion, but also to just use other levers within the FATF system to better achieve that aim.
Excellent. So, Isabella, your interest, amongst others, which you mentioned, are, financial crime involving high-value goods such as art. Now, there were AML regulations introduced last year for high-value art dealers. What changes or impact have you seen after this regulation was introduced, if any?
Yeah, I find the traditional opacity of the art market really, really interesting from a financial crime perspective. So I always like to keep an eye on it. I think I look at the 2 big newly regulated populations, crypto and art in the UK, who fell under the money laundering regulations in January 2020. And I think they've had a difficult ride. I think, especially with the art market, it took some time for those new regulations for participants to become comfortable with them. And I think there's a lot to be said for the pandemic throwing them off track, and that disrupting maybe relationships that were being built with regulators, and just creating that culture of compliance. So I think, they need to be given a bit of leash for that. But I'd like the things what I'm hearing at the moment is that I think it is beginning, the sort of general compliance culture is beginning to embed, and it's sort of less fought against than maybe it was at the beginning. Of course, I would say, probably one of the really interesting things going on in the art market at the moment has, well, less so now, but maybe definitely true for a few months ago, was just that absolute roller coaster of non-fungible tokens, or NFTs, that I think, they do present financial crime risks, but I would say that those financial crime risks aren't completely unique to NFTs. Like, we have seen some of this before. I think, if you were around those heady, crazy days of 2017 and the initial coin offering or ICO hype in the time when Bitcoin went to $17,000, what we see with NFTs, the risks characteristics are quite similar. So, if it looks like a fraud and it smells like a fraud, it's almost definitely a fraud. So don't invest in it. And also, and if you just do your due diligence and are relatively sensible, you will probably, you'll remove the low hanging fruit from a financial crime perspective. So I do think, the art market it's newly regulated. It's going through that transition, but it also has some quite exciting risks, I suppose, but I think they're coping with it well, that have also come in recently, and it'll be interesting to see how that all beds down when some of the hype ebbs away.
Right. So my last question to you for today.
Mm-hmm.
The CFCS has been highlighting many different issues within AML and financial crime. What would you say are the top 3 areas in the fight against financial crime that warrant the highest attention at this point of time by policymakers, regulators, and banks and reporting entities?
It's a big question, and I would say that it's always difficult to answer those types of questions, which from a sort of globally applicable level. But to answer you in reverse, I would say, if you're a reporting entity right now at the coalface of financial crime compliance, I think most people would agree that fraud is the big area that you are facing in terms of severity and volume. In the UK, fraud is now our largest crime type by volume, and I think many people would agree that it has just been on absolute steroids over the past 18 months. How do we counter the problem of fraud? I don't want to say we're on the back foot at all, because I think, although the criminals are very innovative, I think we can learn and adapt quite quickly. I think that includes, first of all, improving our defenses and making sure we educate consumers on what to look out for, remove those lowest hanging fruits. And I think in the UK recently, we see the retail banks putting in some really good controls to ensure against things like authorized push payment frauds. I think the more we can do with that, the better. And again, just wider education of what to look out for. But then also, I think we can't just tackle that problem defensively. We also have to be more proactive in how we counter the issue of fraud. And that is difficult because, as we know from your classic 419 Nigerian email scams, the perpetrators tend to be in countries that their victims are not. So, conducting successful cross-border investigations and enforcement is really difficult. So I think that is something that needs to be looked at. And I suppose that leads me in to what would I say is the biggest issue facing regulators right now. This one, this is always a problem. And I think it's the resourcing of regulators, which is a really important issue, because it's not just in fraud, it's across all the crime types. We need better resourcing. The financial landscape for financial regulators, but also non-financial regulators, looks wildly different than it did when a lot of our supervisory regimes were devised. I mean, just technology has changed a lot. The speed in which everything happens is just incomprehensibly faster than it was when these regimes were thought up. So we need to ensure that our regulators around the world have the resources to oversee their regulated populations, not just to make sure they're doing what's right, but also to supervise in a way that allows room for things like innovation, and for the fact that business models change more quickly than they used to. And going back to sort of where we started, you have to allow room for financial inclusion and, you know, little innovative tweaks to your regime to make sure they're as accessible as possible. You may also want to pursue a more data-driven model to supervision. That's brilliant in theory, but will require technology and also investing in human capital, and that's expensive. And again, I would also say, when thinking of resourcing regulators, it's not also just about that sort of front foot, it's also about the back foot, and ensuring that when breaches do occur, we have the resources in place to really enforce against those breaches. Because is there much of a deterrent at the moment? I mean, to what extent are financial crimes really enforced against in a way that creates a deterrent to criminals? I think globally it's not great. So definitely for regulators, I would say, let's make sure they're really resourced in a way they can do their job effectively. And finally, it was policymakers. So what warrants the highest financial crime attention from policymakers right now? I would say it's a little sinister, but incredibly urgent. And I think we need to be having a more serious and probably a lot more public conversation about the use of illicit finance by hostile state actors to undermine our societies and economies, and really essentially democracy, because it is quite a sort of like a silent threat, but certainly happens when you have, going back to sort of cross-border fraud issues, if you have hostile state actors perpetrating frauds, mass frauds in places like the UK to undermine consumer confidence, or when you see, for example, corruption being deployed strategically to undermine rule of law or the foundations of a fledgling like democracy, that's really alarming. And I think we have to be doing more to call out this activity that might not be so easy to spot. And but I think, you know, we have really important platforms coming up this year, things like President Biden's conference on democracy, as well as the G7, which will be taking place over the next couple of weeks. And I think this will give G7 nation states a real opportunity to think, how can they take proactive measures to ensure that we coordinate and collaborate our domestic activities against illicit finance in a way that allows us to have an effect on those international flows that are really being directed in a way that undermines the things that we all really care about. So a little bit of a sinister note to end it on, but I would say those are probably my top 3 financial crime areas to be looking at right now.
Fantastic. Fantastic. I completely liked all 3 areas. I agree with you on that. The first one, obviously something which I think most people see, but the second 2, which you mentioned, I think, it's really great that you brought those up, because it's important for the compliance community to actually know that. So with that, Isabella, thank you so much for joining us today. It was fantastic speaking with you, and I wish you all the best.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me, and I wish your listeners a lovely weekend.